Good afternoon. I'm Kim Spurr. I'm the M&A Archaeology Division Director, and I'm going to talk to you today about a project that the Museum of Northern Arizona and the National Park Service collaborated on to protect cultural heritage sites along the Grand Canyon river corridor, along the Colorado River through Grand Canyon. So I hope that you find this interesting. Okay, well, let's dive right in here. Grand Canyon National Park was established February 26, 1919, to preserve the amazing natural resources that are found within its boundaries. But there's an abundance of cultural sites as well. And this includes archaeological sites dating back at least 10,000 years. And it includes a lot of landscape and archaeological sites that are very significant to the regional tribes as heritage sites. So it's a very important resource that we try and preserve. John Wesley Powell, who most of you probably know, was the first person that we know of who went down the Colorado River through Grand Canyon, noted only 5 of what he called Indian habitations in his 1869 trip through the canyon. These were pretty substantial sites that were pretty obvious even at that era. There wasn't a lot of archaeology done along the river corridor between Powell's trip and the early 1940s. Starting in the 1940s, a number of archaeologists, Robert Euler, Walter Taylor, Doug Schwartz, started working down there doing reconnaissance surveys. And it wasn't ever anything systematic. It was just going to areas that they thought might have a high likelihood of sites and recording what they found. This is the Granaries at Nankweep Delta. Anyone who's been down the river on a commercial or even a private trip has probably stopped and hiked up here. The photo on the left is one of the very early sites, one of the early photos taken, I believe, in the 1940s. And the photo on the right is a project that was done by the Museum of Northern Arizona and Park Service to check the preservation state of the granaries there and make sure that they're standing up to all the visitation that they get. But one of the things about the early work that was done in the canyon was that most of the people really viewed the canyon as a barrier, not a corridor, not a porous boundary. They really viewed it as a problem, that there weren't many ways across and that they were going to find very different things on either side. And I'll come back to that idea. But I want to start with Doug Schwartz's work. He was working for the School of American Research, now the School of Advanced Research, out of Santa Fe in the 1960s. And it was a multi-year project to really learn what sort of cultural resources were along the river and how people were living there during prehistory. So they worked at Ankar Delta in 1967 and 1968. This is one of the series of masonry rooms that were excavated during that project. This is Bright Angel Pueblo, which is on the river below Indian Gardens. Bright Angel Pueblo was excavated in 1969. And the fence behind it is the trail that everybody traipses across. This site gets a lot of visitation. It kind of takes a beating around the edges. It's one that the park really has to work to maintain. And then in 1970, Schwartz's crew worked at Walhalla Glades up on the north rim at a higher elevation, and it's directly above Ankar Delta. This is one of the multi-room sites that they excavated up there. So one of the reasons that Schwartz excavated these sites up on Walhalla Glades was he was trying to look at the relationship between the river corridor and the highlands. In this photo, I'm standing up on the Walhalla Glades, looking south towards the south rim, and right in the center of the photo, you can see the river. But the drainage that courses down from below me and meets the river there is Ankar Creek, and Ankar Delta is right there where the creek joins the river. So that's where he had worked in 67 and 68. And he was really trying to look at the relationship between the lowlands and the highlands. And he's really the first one who defined the canyon not so much as a barrier, but as more of a boundary between culture units, and was looking at relationships. And his model, he ultimately proposed a model of seasonal transhumans, which basically means movement. So that the people were living in the canyon in the winter and farming on the rim in the summer, and that it was the same people moving back and forth. And this was a pretty novel idea because, like I said, a lot of people had thought there were different populations. After Schwartz's work, there was some intermittent projects sponsored by the Park Service, mainly to explore sites that were being damaged by erosion or by visitation. And that sort of work went on through the 70s, 80s, and 90s. In 2006, the Park Service approached the museum as a partner to do some limited excavations at 9 sites along the river corridor. And this was a really large, complex site. Was the biggest project that's really been done down there in recent memory. Overall, there were more than 90 people involved in the field work and the lab work. There were 14 sessions by boat. And so we would pack up all of our gear at Lee's Ferry and boat down, stop and work at the sites, and then float on through. The Park Service had interpreters available at almost all the sites we worked at, and encouraged people going through on river trips to stop and see what was being done, in part because this was funded by monies that partially came from river permits and fees that the public paid. So we wanted to show what we were doing with their money. There was also a museum exhibit that came out of this project that was at the Kolb Studio on the south rim of Grand Canyon and at the Museum in Northern Arizona. There was a plateau edition, the magazine of the museum. There were symposia at 2 different professional conferences and multiple public lectures. So it was a pretty high profile project. At the end, I will give you some links to some online material that was produced as part of that. So the way the sites were chosen for this project they were all sites that had been damaged mainly by natural erosion. Obviously, the Grand Canyon is an erosional environment. And sometimes it's hard to protect sites that lie on drainages next to the river because they just get impacted year after year or season after season by rain and erosion. And so all of the sites where we worked, the Park Service has already attempted to stabilize them by putting in check dams or rerouting drainages around sites. And it wasn't working well enough. And so the sites were endangered. Very few of the sites were fully excavated. We tried to just work on the areas that were in danger and leave the rest of the resources. One important part of this is that all of the affiliated tribes that the Park Service consults with on a regular basis reviewed the treatment plan. And so they were in the know about what we were going to do down there. We actually had one trip where some tribal representatives came down. And so that was great because we got their input on the project and how we should proceed with it. So we worked at one site that was at the upper end of Marble Canyon, one site that was in the very lower portion of Grand Canyon, but the vast majority of the sites were in a 15-mile stretch below the confluence of the Little Colorado River and the Colorado. And this is partly a reflection of the site density in that area. It's an area of the canyon that's wider than a lot of them and has a flat bottom. So it's a much easier place to live than some of the very tightly confined areas of the park. So today I want to talk about the results of excavations at 7 of the sites. The first one is Axe Handle Alcove, which is, like I said, up at the upper end of Marble Canyon. It's a small alcove. As you float by, it doesn't look like much, but it protects and keeps dry a surprisingly large amount of real estate. The excavations reveal 3 meters, which is about 10 feet, of natural and cultural sediment deposition. So in this photo, you can see it's like a layer cake. The lighter colored layers in here are the fine sediments that were deposited by overbank flooding. When the river flooded high enough to get up onto that terrace that we saw in the last photo, it would deposit a layer of this fine gray sediment. And then the red layers are the colluvium, the material eroded from the cliff behind the alcove. And so it's not every year you don't get both, but that's what these amazingly fine-grained stratigraphy reflect. And through the work, we excavated slightly over 30 thermal features, so hearths, roasting features, that kind of thing. In this photo, you can see on the right-hand unit, you can see a number of pits, and those are the fire hearths that have already been excavated. The radiocarbon dates from this site indicated that it was occupied since about 2500 BC. Most of the occupation occurred between 2500 and 1000 BC, which is what archaeologists call the Middle and Late Archaic period. This was prior to agriculture, prior to permanent settlements. People were moving around the landscape. And what they were doing in this area actually was probably collecting raw stone material for making stone tools. The terraces, the river terraces adjacent to the alcove have a lot of high quality cherts and quartzite nodules that would have been very desirable as tool stone. This is a photo, let me see if I can go back. Yeah, so in this unit, in this photo, on the left-hand unit, you can see a jumble of rocks stuck in the left-hand wall. And this is a view of that feature looking straight on. This is a big roasting pit that was dug, fire built in the bottom of it, layer of rocks put in to conserve the heat, and then the food that you wanted to cook laid on top of the rocks would have been covered over with sediment, probably vegetation to protect the food, and then sediment, and allowed to steam. It's a method that's been used for thousands of years across the entire Western US. It's very distinctive. And this feature here is actually the latest one that we found at Axe Handle Alcove, and it dated from about AD 500. So moving on down the canyon, come to the confluence of the Little Colorado River and the Colorado River. And we call this site the Lower Confluence site. And you can see it's on a pretty steep slope. There was a whole series of small drainages that were destroying parts of a small structure, which is what we excavated. This one, this is the structure. It was a 2-room structure built against a big talus boulder. This is obviously a view from above, has a central fireplace in it, and had been remodeled several times. So the wall configurations were a challenge to excavate. So one of the interesting things about this site is it dates much later. It's what the archaeologists call the Pueblo II period, the early Pueblo II period, about AD 1050 to 1080. And this represents one of the earlier permanent habitations in this part of the canyon. And one of the interesting things is that we found flood sediments directly on top of the floor here. So what it looked like is that maybe they had moved down there, but weren't familiar with the flood cycle of the river. There's no other big rivers in the area. And if you were moving down from the rim, you wouldn't know necessarily that there's huge flood every spring. And that's what it looks like, is that maybe they had to beat a pretty hasty retreat from this site, which was kind of an interesting thing. It gave us a nice insight into use of the site. This is an artist reconstruction of the site. So there's the 2 rooms, little hall. It may have been a little bit less of a steep slope at that time. We're looking upstream towards the junction of the Little Colorado. Moving on down a little bit further, we come to a large area below the desert Palisades, for those of you who are familiar with the canyon. And this site dates just a little bit later, about 1070 to 1085. It's definitely a long-term habitation, had multiple habitation rooms. And this site was also being impacted by a series of arroyos. You can see in this photo, the foreground of the photo shows a drainage that's going right through the edge of this structure. Now, this is a little bit hard to visualize, so I'm going to go through this. The upright slabs right in the middle of the photo, those are the lower walls of the structure, and the flat area to the lower left of them would have been the floor surface. So it's a habitation room that's semi-subterranean, had slab lining on the lower part. Upper part was probably built of brush or wood, and it's been bisected by this drainage. We also found a very large kiva at the site, fully lined with masonry, and it was in surprisingly good shape. One wall had slumped, but this was good. It was an interesting thing. This was the first kiva, fully subterranean kiva that had been excavated in the canyon. And one of our tribal representatives said, we knew they had to be there somewhere, so it's great that you guys finally found one of these because we knew they would have been here because they're such an important part of village life. So the people who were occupying this site had moved down from the east or southeast rim of the canyon. They're part of a culture that we call the Cayenneta Culture, which is found from about Cayenneta, Navajo Mountain area, south to Tuba City, actually all around the south of the San Juan River. And we think one of the main reasons they had moved down there was to produce cotton. This is burned cotton seeds that we found in the excavation. And the reason this is important is that cotton is a persnickety crop. It doesn't grow well in all environments. And in particular, it needs constant water, it needs warm temperatures. And those are things that don't always go together in the Southwest. So cotton production was fairly limited. We see cotton production in Canyon de Chelly, Glen Canyon, Grand Canyon, the Homology area over by Winslow, along the Little Colorado. So there's a fairly limited area that you can grow cotton successfully, but it's a very important crop. It's a good food crop, and it also obviously can be used for textiles, for weaving, and it's a very important cotton clothing and other cotton items play a large part in modern tribal ceremonies. And we extrapolate that may have been the case in the past as well. So if you, for instance, were a Cayenta farmer living on the rim of Grand Canyon and you moved down into the canyon to grow cotton, you would have had a ready market. You would have had a great economic crop. And so we think that may be one of the main reasons they were down there. Moving on down a few miles, we come to Furnace Flats. So again, those of you who are familiar with the canyon, this is a wide open area. There's multiple routes in and out between Desert Palisades and Furnace Flats. This is just above Ankar Delta, where Doug Schwartz worked. And this is an overview. I've taken this from across the canyon looking towards the site. And the area of the site where we worked is in the lower left, just below that red layered cliff. This is a close-up of it. This shows you the actual area. And you can see a whole series of drainages, little arroyos that are cutting through. And so there were multiple habitation and storage features that were being exposed along these drainages, and due to the gradient, they couldn't be stabilized. So that's why we worked here. This site had an initial short-term use in the AD 900s, probably by a group that was just passing through, gathering, or maybe hunting. But the major occupation was from about 1110 to 1160 AD. And during this period, they built multiple room blocks with a lot of storage features. And the storage features are one of the things that tell us it was a long-term habitation. If you're just living somewhere for the summer or for brief, you don't need a lot of storage. But if you're living somewhere long-term, especially over the winter, you need somewhere to store your crops and other foods that they will remain viable through the winter. And so that's one of the things we see here in this room. So I'm looking down into a room that's been excavated. You can see the stone masonry. There's a slab-lined fire hearth right in the middle of the room. And there's another one at the lower left corner. You can see the slab lining part of the floor there in the lower portion. And the big hole sort of lower center was a big storage pit that was beneath the floor of the house. So interestingly, the ceramics, and archaeologists love ceramics because they tell us a lot. They can tell us the age of a site based on design patterns that have been cross-correlated with tree ring dates. They can tell us who made them in terms of cultural affiliation, because different archaeological and ethnographic cultures make their pottery and design their pottery slightly differently. And so the style of the pottery is something that we use very frequently to talk about the relationships among prehistoric peoples. So when we were at Palisades, I mentioned that the people occupying that site had moved down from the rim, the southeast rim of the canyon. And we know that because of the ceramic styles. At Furnace Flats, it looks like the people were moving down from the northwest side of the canyon. So they're bringing slightly different pottery styles. Although by the end of the occupation at Furnace Flats, it really looked like people were producing their own pottery. We have good evidence of ceramic production. And so they had become kind of unto themselves. They were a community down in the bottom of the canyon. This is about the same time as the multiple structures at Ankar Delta that Doug Schwartz excavated. Also at Cardenas, if you've been down in the canyon, you know there's a big site directly across the river. So this was probably a pretty intense community of occupation that was taking place. I'll talk about that again a little bit later. Furnace Flats presented its own challenges just because of the amount of deposition. We had to move a lot of sediment to get to these deeply buried. You can see here the amount of sand overlying these rooms. But you can also see in this room the massive size of some of the stone blocks around that form the base of those walls. These people were obviously building to be here long term, and this really was their home. They weren't just passing through here. In addition to evidence for ceramic production, we have ornament production. So this is a sort of soapstone travertine material that occurs locally in the area down there. And we found a lot of ornaments that were completed like these, and also a lot of manufacturing debris. One of the rooms actually looked like a workshop where they were producing these things. This is another artist's reconstruction of what Furnace Flats might have looked like. You can see the multiple room blocks that cross those multiple drainages. We have some crops down along the river set against the backdrop of that very prominent cliff. Between Furnace Flats and Ankar Delta, we have one more site. And in this photo, Ankar Delta is the landform in the upper right. That's where Doug Schwartz worked and excavated multiple rooms. It was a big community, probably about the same time period. This one, I'm standing at the head of this quite large arroyo, and you can see the erosion that it's caused. If you look right in the middle, there's two people and a couple of screens. And what they're working on is this. This is a face of the arroyo that's been truncated. And you can see in the middle of it, there's a dark layer right in the middle of that face. That is a series of burned rooms that were built of, not of masonry, but of hakal, which is a mud and wood construction material. And the big slab sort of in the right center of the photo was one wall of this room, and then it extended for several meters. Ultimately it burned, and then it was buried by, you can see, multiple meters of sediment. So it had only been exposed by this arroyo, but at the same time the arroyo was eating into it, and you can see all of the burned material and slabs that have fallen out of that wall. So this was another site where we sort of tunneled in like gophers, and we excavated the features that were exposed there. In addition to the hakal rooms, there was a masonry room with this nice slab-lined floor. This was probably a kiva as well, probably similar to the one at Palisades. This site was, again, occupied between about 1130 and 1180, about the same time period as Ankar Delta and Furnace Flats. And then we go around and we get on the other side of Ankar Delta. So in this photo, I'm looking back upriver, and that flat area in the center of the photo is Ankar Delta. And on the other side of that big cliff is where Furnace Flats is. This is a site that was a long-term occupation, but the architecture was very different. So instead of having big masonry walls, the vast majority of the habitation rooms at this site were built of Hakal. And in this photo, you can see a big square room, and the lower walls are defined by upright slabs, and those would stabilize the wood and mortar upper walls of this room. You can see multiple storage pits within it, slab-lined hearth right in the middle of it. And this was a very good sized room. It was probably about 12, 14 feet square. So it was a pretty roomy thing. There was interior storage, and there was also a whole series of exterior storage sits. These are slab-lined floors, upright slabs, and they would have been covered by wooden and mud superstructures that would have sealed to keep the food over the winter. Again, showing that these people were here long-term. One of the interesting things about this site is that ceramics on it were some of the latest that have been documented along the river corridor in Grand Canyon. And so this site was actually probably occupied towards the very, very end of this big community down there. Maybe even afterwards, this may have been one of the last sites in this stretch of the river that was occupied, going up into the early 1200s. So those are the main sites in that Furnace Flats area. And then we zip far down the canyon to the west end. This is obviously the geology is very different. If you compare it, there's very little flat area right next to the river. There's not a lot of great agricultural land. It's much drier. And so there are fewer of those large agricultural habitation sites than what we see in the upper reaches. But what there are lots of natural resources that can be used. So for thousands of years, but very much up into the historic period, one of the resources that was desirable in this area was agave. And those of you who are familiar with agave, it makes a lovely full cactus shaped thing. But if you dig down to the bottom of it, the portion underground is a big basketball sized sort of a tuber. It's very high in carbohydrates, very high in calories. And these would have been dug up in the late summer by the people living down there, and they're roasted. And so they roast them in these big roasters, kind of like what I was describing earlier, and then process the pulp by pounding it into thin sheets, drying it, and it's a food that will last for a long time. This photo right here, I'm looking across the small creek towards that little mound that doesn't have much vegetation on it. And that's where the site lies. And this site is really composed of a series of these big roasting features that haven't been buried. So we're actually seeing them exposed on the surface. You can see all of the dark charcoal stained soil there with the white rocks. All of that white rock is limestone. And limestone is really the preferred material to use in these. Holds heat very well, stands up. You can use it over and over before it just disintegrates and falls apart. When we dug trenches through these features, you can see here that the site's been used over and over again. There's just layers of sort of smiley face charcoal deposits, and that's each episode of use of one of these roaster pits. And they would just come back the next year, a few years later, when the agave crop was good in that area again, just move over and dig another roasting pit. So we see these overlapped and overlying each other. But we also found, this is again artist reconstruction, the foreground is that roasting pit area that I just showed you. And then to the right-hand side, there's some wooden wiki-ups. We found an area adjacent to the roasting pits that was fairly flat and had debitage from production of stone tools. And we didn't find any wooden remains of these, but this is very typical of possibly a early historic camp, Paiute, Wallapai, Havasupai ancestors, are probably who were in this area. Although we did get some dates from this site that go back into the 1000s. These roaster complexes are pretty common in the western part of the Grand Canyon. This is one of the park archaeologists with us. He's standing next to one of these roasting features that has been bisected by a drainage, and you can see it's really big. It's that entire crescent-shaped thing that's almost as long as he is tall. That's another topic. We'll have to do do a whole topic on roasting pits because they're pretty interesting things. So, sort of to recap, what this project showed us and provided information for Park Service that for them to better manage their resources and also provide interpretation for the public. There's evidence of human use of both the rims and the river corridor going back thousands and thousands of years, but it looks like the earliest permanent use dates to the Pueblo II period around 1050, 1070 AD. And we, as I mentioned at the Lower Confluence site, it looks like maybe they weren't quite sure what the river was doing and they built a little too close to the river and had to leave the site when it flooded. By the time we get to the Palisades site, and in particular Furnace Flats, they're picking slightly higher places. And while some outlying portions of the site had flood deposits on them, none of the structures, none of the habitations had been impacted. So it looks like people are adapting to this new environment, possibly doing cotton agriculture, maybe even irrigating to some degree. Cotton would have been very happy if they'd been able to bring water out of the river up to the field levels. It looks like people were initially coming into the canyon from the southeast rims, people of the Cayenneta culture, whereas later, by 50 or 100 years later, we're seeing population movement from the northwest side of the canyon. And ultimately, people are building whole communities down in along the river. And they're really there long term, at least until the early 1200s, maybe 1250 AD. And at that point, I won't say the permanent occupation ends, but the larger communities, large scale room blocks and year-round habitations are ending. And then after that, what we see is a lot of movement of people around the canyon. They're using specific resources. They're staying for shorter periods of time. This is reflected throughout the historic period. The Havasupai and the Wallapai people who still live at the west end of the canyon have settlements on the rims and in the mid elevations and down near the river. And they use the resources of all of those areas to maintain their lifestyle. This project also indicated several things: that the canyon is not a barrier. People were moving across it. The most dense area of sites is in an area where you can access both rims, up and down canyons. And I think that for people who are used to this landscape and used to a rigorous way of life, that wouldn't have been at all difficult. And I think that we see that it reinforced what Doug Schwartz saw, I think, to a great degree. That's mostly what I wanted to cover. There's a few questions over here on chat. One person asked whether cotton is really a food crop. And actually, yes, it's the seeds. Not the bolls, obviously, the fluffy stuff, but the seeds are very high in fat, they're high in protein, and they can be eaten just as seeds. We find cotton seeds in human coprolites, in fecal samples. but they can also be pressed for oil. I mean, you can buy cottonseed oil, just like grapeseed oil. So it's actually a really good food crop. There's a question about the Kiva. I presume he's talking about the Kiva at Palisades, when it was built and used. That site was really occupied pretty intensively between about 1070 to about 1085. So the last half of the 11th century, probably a couple of generations of people lived there. Somebody wanted to know if we had evidence of wooden structural elements. And the answer is yes. So from the site between Furnace Flats and Ankar Delta, where we had the really deeply buried burned room, burning will often preserve organic materials. And that's true of wood, it's true of basketry, it's true of textiles. And if they get charred, not heavily burned, which will destroy them, but charred, then the preservation is actually quite good. So we had structural beams there that we collected for dendrochronological dating, and a few of them did return dates, although they were slightly divergent, and it probably reflects the fact that people were using driftwood. And so if a tree dies up on the rim, it takes it some years to die and fall over, and then get washed down the side drainage, and then get washed down the main river. So the time period between when that tree died and when it was used as a roof beam can be pretty substantial. And so it's difficult to use dendrochronological methods at sites where they were building with driftwood. But we were able to find structural wood. And then another question, did they hunt, fish, and did we find any stone tools? And the answer is yes. All of these sites had abundant ground stones, so manos, metates, that they were using to process corn, wild seeds, cotton, if they were eating that. And so we found a lot of ground stone artifacts. We have stone tools, projectile points, what we call bifaces, which would be knives for cutting, scraping. So yeah, there's in fact, some of the best tool stone material is actually found right in cobbles from the river. It gets brought down from the higher elevations. So they would have had access to pretty good tool stone. And we do see that. In your question about if we found fish is interesting because we do have animal bone that we found at several sites that tells us they were eating a lot of rabbits and other small game, some deer, some bighorn sheep. And it's interesting if you think about it, if you're a farmer and you have fields of corn, that would be very attractive to rabbits and other small rodents, things like that. So hunting those animals actually helps you protect your crops as well as provide you with a protein source. And we do see that there's actually a higher percentage of small game than there is of large game. It's also in part, if you're a farmer, you have to spend most of your time focused on your crops, and you're probably not doing long-term hunting expeditions except maybe during the winter. The other thing is that in areas, and this is true sort of across the Southwest, when people first move into an area, there's a lot more large game, deer, bighorn sheep, that kind of thing. But those animals don't tend to like to cohabitate with humans. And so the more people there are, the more they move out of an area and they get overhunted. And so through time, we usually see a decline in the amount of large animal bone that's being processed for food. Any burial grounds near these communities? No, we did not. There would have been burial areas associated with a long-term habitation. We did not encounter any burials during this project. And if we had, they would have been left in place and avoided them. That is the protocol set up with the tribal descendant groups, but we didn't have any. And so people may have been buried slightly off-site or in areas of the sites that we weren't working in. Did they have animals like horses and cattle? No. The only domesticated animal that was present in the Southwest during this time period was the turkey. We didn't get any turkey bone from any of these sites, but there are certainly sites contemporaneous in the 11th, 12th centuries that they were raising turkey. We find eggs, we find turkey burials. And turkeys were probably used both for food and as a main source of feathers, because feathers can be used to make blankets. They can be woven into blankets and other warm textiles. They can be used, obviously, for ceremonial decorations. So turkeys would have been an important component, but we didn't find any. They also had domesticated dogs. And again, we didn't have any dog skeletons, but I'm sure that they were living. They had dogs down there. Horses and cattle both came in during the historic period when the Spanish first came into the Southwest. And I'm just talking about the Southwest here. They came into other parts of North America at different times. But cattle are an old world species and were never here until Europeans arrived in the New World. So the one question is, are there pictures and reports from these excavations available? And that is actually an excellent question. That was my next thing. So the Park Service, in addition to funding this work, they paid for video documentation of several sessions when we were down there and photographic documentation. And then they also funded an exhibit, a museum exhibit that was at Kolb Studio and Museum of Northern Arizona, 2011 and 12, I believe. But for those exhibits and for general public, there's a couple of really good videos. I don't want to go into websites, but if you just Google, if you go to Bing and Google Grand Canyon National Park archaeology, there's a whole series of videos that will come up. There's one that's about 16 minutes and it's called Grand Canyon Archaeology that was done for this project. And it's really an interesting video. It has footage of a lot of the excavations. It has a lot of coverage of the sites. It has interviews with some of the tribal representatives who we worked with and some of the archaeologists on the project as well. But there's also some shorter, just real quick snips of us working at those sites. And if you go on the National Park Service Grand Canyon webpage, there is a section on history that you can, if you just Google Grand Canyon archaeology, there's a whole series of pages that will talk about more specifically the excavations at each one of these sites. So yeah, so there's some interesting stuff out there. We did produce a massive technical report, but that's really not anything anybody wants to read except other archaeologists. And it had pretty limited distribution. Another question, were the artifacts curated or left at the site? In the specific areas that we excavated that were in danger from erosion, we did bring those artifacts back and they are curated at Grand Canyon National Park. In areas that were still stable and they weren't in danger of being damaged by erosion or by visitation, all of that was left in place. And there's at every one of these sites, with one exception, I think, there's still a lot of archaeology in the ground. And that's an important component of archaeology. The way we do archaeology these days is we really try and preserve as much as we can, in part because archaeological techniques change over time. And in the future, there might be techniques that we don't even know about now that can provide even more information. And also because it's honoring the tribe's preferences, the associated tribes' preferences, that their ancestors and their ancestral sites be disturbed as little as possible. So that's a pretty important ethic in archaeology these days. Okay, so the question is, if M&A was to undertake NPS partnership projects again, would you push for more tribal involvement? Yes. So M&A does a lot of partnership projects with National Park Service units. We currently have cooperative agreements with 9 different National Park Service units in the Southwest, ranging from Arches National Monument up in Utah, or national park up in Utah to White Sands National Park down in southern New Mexico. We work with a lot of Park Service units. We work with a lot of tribes. And the Park Service is becoming extremely proactive about collaborating with tribes and running treatment plans and research designs, and any work that's going to be done near archaeological sites gets reviewed by whatever tribes are affiliated with that park. So the tribes have a much, much stronger say in how work is conducted than they did even a decade ago, certainly 20 or 30 years ago. And that's something that's really important. If not, I mean, it's important from an ethical and from a management point of view, but it's also important from a practical point of view, because these people know their heritage, they know the sites, and they can offer us a lot of information going in that's important for us. And then in exchange, we can offer them information that they might not get other ways. So they're very important collaborative relationships. And the Museum of Northern Arizona, which was founded in 1928, has a very strong history of working with tribes in the region. We hold collections from a number of tribes, and we've worked with several tribes to help them establish curation programs. So we already had that relationship going in, and I think this project just made it better. Oh, how do you become an archaeologist? Well, you learn as much about prehistory and history as you can. You figure out what area you're interested in. Most archaeologists these days specialize in one area or one region or one time period, because there's so much to know. I would advise you, if you are young and you think you want to be an archaeologist, get some experience as early as you can. Join a public dig project. Go to there's a number of places like Crow Canyon Archaeological Institute, or there's a few places in California and across the West that offer archaeology programs for teenagers or college kids, because a lot of people think they want to be an archaeologist until they go do field work. It's not all fun and games. It can be, but it's not always. And I know a number of people who have quit archaeology very shortly after their career started, because they decided it really wasn't for them. So that's my biggest piece of advice, is to get some hands-on experience early on and decide if that's really what you want to do. Thank you very much for joining us today.